Good evening, friends, and welcome to our panel exploring homelessness and unaffordable housing. How we got here, what actions are being taken, and what needs to happen. My name is Gail Rappel, lead for the First Unitarian Church of Hamilton's Social Justice Team, and this event is part of Housing Month here in our church. I'm joined by our panel, three congregants: Bill Johnson, co-chair of our Affordable Housing Team; journalist Denise Davey, author of soon-to-be-released book, Her Name Was Margaret, Life and Death on the Streets, which is based on years of research into life of Margaret Jacobson, who lived and died on our streets; and Dr. Tim O'Shea, co-founder of Hamilton's Social Justice Medicine Response Team, whose opinion pieces and quotes have been in The Spectator, and whose October 4th sermon was entitled Prescribing a Home. As is our custom, though we are not physically assembled in our church, let's first acknowledge the land on which Tim, Denise, Bill, and I are meeting this evening. We are situated upon the traditional territories of various Indigenous nations, covered by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Covenant. We also recognize that our community is home to many Indigenous people, and that we must learn as much as we can about their rich history and culture so that we can better understand our role as stewards of this earth in solidarity with them. In 2014, our congregation, First Unitarian Hamilton, embarked on a process of determining how to transform ourselves and our congregation through faith-based social justice work. One of the three initiatives we chose was learning about and advocating for affordable housing. Increasingly, sadly, this has become a process of understanding why and how housing has become unaffordable for so many, and what the consequences are for both individuals and communities. Tonight, we will begin by hearing briefly from each of our three panelists, though in each case, they could take the full hour to explain both the background to and the outcomes of this crisis. They'll be speaking about their own learning and experiences for which we in this congregation and beyond are grateful. Following their panel presentations, I'll be asking them some questions to allow us to delve more deeply into the issues. Dr. Tim O'Shea will begin by sharing his experiences and recommendations from the perspective of a health practitioner on the front lines, serving those who are currently unhoused or precariously housed. Denise will explore the issue of homelessness from one person's story and share her thoughts about the precariousness of remaining safely housed. Bill will close out this opening section with the big picture, detailing the housing history, both Canadian and local, and a bit about how we got here and where we are now. Tim, let us begin with you.
Thank you, Gail, and thanks to everybody for letting me be here today. It's a pleasure to take part in this panel and to speak with everybody here. I'm looking forward to the discussion and delving a bit deeper into issues as we get through that. But just in terms of kind of the opening remarks or framing from my perspective, as I was thinking about this, this afternoon and leading into the discussion, one of the things I was thinking about was all the different ways that we could talk about the importance of housing and the different kind of lenses and frames that we could look at that through. But I think what I'd like to focus on, and probably the reason why I'm here to talk today is from the perspective of a medical practitioner who spends a lot of my time now really dealing with the effects of homelessness on people's health. So just in terms of a bit of a background, again, I've talked about this before, but the Hamilton Social Medicine Response Team was started in 2016 as a way to try to address some of the gaps in the healthcare system which people fall into. And so it was meant to try to help people who weren't accessing care for whatever reason. And one of the main groups that we ended up working with, and the group that we work the most with now, is people who are experiencing homelessness. And our very naive perspective at that point was that in terms of the health outcomes, the main problem was that people weren't getting access to the care that they needed. And so we thought if we were able to bring that care to them in whatever way that, or whatever shape or way that manifested, if it meant going to their house or going to a coffee shop or going to a shelter or to a park or wherever it was that they were, if we were able to bring the healthcare to them, that we would be able to mitigate some of those negative effects of not having access and make their health better. And what we learned very quickly, especially for the people that were homeless or didn't have access to housing on a regular basis, was that no matter what we did in terms of prescribing medications or organizing tests or driving people to appointments or whatever it was that we would do from that perspective, we were really not very effective at all in moving the bar in terms of making their health better. And a lot of that was because of the fact that they didn't have a place to put their head at night. They didn't have a warm place to sleep. They didn't have a bed to sleep in or a place to call their own. And kind of when you think of the hierarchy of needs that people have, shelter is really at the bottom of that. And if that's not there, then all of the other things don't follow. And so this has played out for me with a number of my patients. Some patients who I've spent 6 months to a year really doing my very, very best to get them the medicines that they need, get them the tests that they need, and not seeing anything really move. And then suddenly they get access to housing and things change very, very quickly. And I've seen it the other way as well, where people will be making very significant gains in their mental health and physical health, and suddenly their housing will disappear for whatever reason. And we'll probably talk about why that happens through the talk today, and the different ways that people find themselves in the situation of homelessness. But as soon as that housing goes away, all of those gains and all of that hard work goes away as well, and we find ourselves right back at the starting line. So I think I had a bit of a sense of the importance of housing going into this project in 2016, but I have definitely had my eyes open to see how it really is primary when we talk about healthcare, talking about things like housing, access to food, access to a secure place to live really is an important base that everybody needs in order to make any gains at all. So again, that's the perspective that I think that I'd like to bring to the conversation and to talk more about as we go through it. And as I said, I'm really looking forward to diving into that a bit deeper in the discussion piece as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Gail, and all of the other people who helped organize this event behind the scenes, and also welcome to everyone who is going to be watching this. As Gail mentioned, I have a book coming out in February that tells the life story of a homeless woman named Margaret, who I met while on assignment for the Hamilton Spectator. The one photo I have behind me was taken at our first meeting, and the other one is, and can you see it okay? Is of Margaret as a child. I had these structured like this, so I take both of them with me when I give talks. And I think the one I have of her as a child is especially important because people need to be reminded that homeless people like Margaret were someone's daughter or son and not just a nameless nobody. Although my meeting with Margaret took place more than 25 years ago, the sad reality is that the problem of homelessness not only still exists today, in my mind, it's gotten worse. That was a key reason why I decided to write my book. And because when I looked at Hamilton and cities across this country, the hundreds of people who make up our homeless are also among the most vulnerable of any population, and yet they're sleeping on our streets. So I want to tell you a bit about Margaret because in many ways she's representative of many of the people on our streets way back then and today. So she'd been homeless for about 10 years when I met her, and she was so run down, she looked like an inmate from a Victorian workhouse. I guessed that she was in her 70s, and I was absolutely shocked to learn that she was only 49. She had been diagnosed with schizophrenia as a teenager and had been hospitalized at the Hamilton Psychiatric Hospital in the 1960s, where she had the great misfortune to be admitted when deinstitutionalization was in full swing. Because the much promised community supports never materialized, many patients like Margaret who were discharged went from 24/7 care inside the hospital to having to suddenly fend for themselves. So during the 20 plus years that Margaret was in the hospital, there were many attempts to move her into the community. These persisted despite the fact she always ended up in a horrific state and would be readmitted weeks or months later, covered with dirt and lice and extremely malnourished. One time she was found in the basement of an apartment building eating garbage out of a dumpster, and she told doctors she'd been there on and off for about 2 years. Margaret belonged to that group of people known as the chronically homeless, who are the sickest of the sick. Many, like Margaret, live under the shadow of addiction and mental illness. They sleep in store doorways, under bridges, in fields, and in cardboard boxes in cemeteries. One of Margaret's favorite spots one summer was a park bench in a quiet park in the east of the downtown. They've rejected shelters, as Margaret did, because of diseases and outbreaks that often plague shelters, or perhaps they'd lined up for a bed so many times and been turned away that they'd given up. There's a huge shortage of beds for homeless women in the city. They might have been a victim of violence in a shelter, especially if they're women, or maybe they have a precious pet that's the only thing that gets them through their days. And most shelters don't take pets. Margaret would stay at the Wesley Drop-In because she didn't like shelters. And I think the other reason she didn't like shelters was because they reminded of her days of being institutionalized. Now during the pandemic, what they're seeing is some homeless people are avoiding shelters for fear of getting the virus, which is actually quite a valid concern given so many have underlying health problems. So to be clear, it's not that people have turned their backs on shelters because they prefer the streets, it's because they've run out of options. The other reality is that up to 70% of homeless people have some kind of mental illness, and without their medication, like Margaret, it was very difficult for her to make sort of a healthy or rational decision. For Margaret and thousands of others, the lack of services in community and shortage of housing have led them into homelessness and are a key reason why today across Canada on any given night, about 35,000 people are homeless. They're victims of a plan gone mad and one that's proven deadly for thousands of people like Margaret. As Tim was saying, they have the very complex medical problems, and they show up at ER departments with diabetes, cirrhosis of the liver, level 4 cancers. They're treated overnight with whatever they can do, discharged into a lifestyle that pretty much guarantees they'll be back in ER a few nights later. So the reality is that our system of shelters and food programs is really just keeping people alive for 1 or 2 more nights and not solving the problem. Because people who are homeless rely so heavily on costly emergency services, studies show it costs anywhere from $60,000 to $100,000 per year to keep a homeless person on the streets. When you consider it can cost around $24,000 to house someone in supportive housing, the answer to ending homelessness crisis seems pretty obvious. So in conclusion, I just wanted to say that I called my book, Her Name Was Margaret, because I do think that once people know the names of people who live on our streets, it's harder for them to look away. And I think that once we know the cost of homelessness, both human and economic, that it's clear we can't afford to look away any longer. So I'll turn it over to Bill. Thank you very much.
So welcome everyone. And thank you, Tim and Denise. The situations that Tim and Denise have described are truly intolerable, and yet they've existed for decades. And one of the questions that I've been wrestling with for the 5 years that I've been working on the issue of housing is, how is it possible in a country as rich as Canada that we have people living on our streets? Attempting to answer that question briefly risks gross oversimplification, but here goes. Part of the context, and it's only part of the homeless crisis, is the crisis of affordable housing, more accurately, unaffordable housing. For those with the lowest incomes, of course, unaffordable housing is always a crisis. What has changed over the past half century is a large increase in the number of households whose incomes are no longer enough to afford the rapidly rising costs of housing. Most Canadians have seen relatively little income growth beyond inflation since about 1980. At the same time, our governments have scaled back the welfare state, social assistance became more meager, and unemployment insurance more limited and harder to qualify for. Tax cuts have deprived governments of revenues needed for basic services, including housing. Closing tens of thousands of beds of psychiatric hospitals, in-house psychiatric hospitals, without providing adequate community services left thousands of people at risk of homelessness, as Denise described. And it also left them competing with existing low-income tenants for the relatively small number of inexpensive places to live. Although most housing in Canada is provided through the private market, there was a period from the 1960s through the 1980s, basically, when the federal and provincial governments did invest in building affordable housing. Part of the reason was a huge demand for houses that was created as the baby boom generation started forming families. The government made meeting that demand more difficult, at least made meeting it through private construction more difficult, when it overhauled the Income Tax Act in 1971, in closing a loophole that made investments in private rental housing much less attractive. So the federal and provincial governments provided subsidies to get housing built. For a time, federal and provincial subsidies resulted in more than 20,000 new affordable housing units being built every year. More than 600,000 public, social, and co-op housing units were built in that time. It made a significant difference. Those 600,000 units are most of the units we still have today. And then it all stopped. As governments struggled to reduce deficits, the Mulroney government first trimmed housing spending, and then in 1993, they ended all funding for new housing. A few years later, the Chrétien government ended federal involvement in social housing, downloading that responsibility to provincial governments. The Harris government in Ontario, after stopping construction of 17,000 approved affordable housing units, downloaded the responsibility to cities. The Harris government also chopped social welfare rates by 21.5%. Predictably, by the late 1990s, homelessness had become a very visible crisis, and more people found themselves paying too much for their housing. The federal government was forced to respond, and it did. And the 2017 National Housing Strategy is the most ambitious effort yet. But even with it, the amount of money being invested today is less than during the boom years, and it doesn't provide the same level of subsidy. Meanwhile, housing prices have really taken off since the late 1990s. By that period, inflation was low and so were interest rates. That made it easier to buy a home, and so people did in droves. Rule changes that the government introduced to encourage home ownership, such as requiring only very small down payments, added to the demand. High demand drove up prices. Rapidly rising prices attracted speculators seeking quick gains, further adding to demand. Rents were also rising. The Harris government lifted rent controls on vacant units. So that means when a tenant moves out of a unit, the landlord can raise the rent by any amount. Landlords were also allowed to apply for increases to cover some capital costs. Very little private rental has been built for decades, but those new rules made it attractive for investors to buy older buildings, encourage or push tenants to leave and then raise the rent. I will close with 3 charts. One shows the increase in prices for housing between 2000 and 2015. Average house prices increased 173% in that period. Incomes increased 47%. In other words, average housing prices increased 3.5 times faster than incomes. And since 2015, average housing prices have jumped by another 73%. The second slide was going to be a comparison of rent increases and inflation between 2009 and 2019 for the old city of Hamilton. Rent has risen almost 2.5 times faster than inflation. In that 10-year period, in summary, while incomes grew relatively slowly over the past 40 years, governments stopped funding affordable housing, and new rules and low interest rates sent housing costs soaring. The result was a vast number of households struggling to pay high housing costs. Housing costs are defined as unaffordable for statistical purposes if you're paying 30% or more of your income for housing. There are 55,000 Hamilton households that are paying that rate. Of those, 13,000, almost 14,000 households pay half of their income for housing, and there are households that pay even more than that. All of them are at real risk of being unable to pay and then evicted. And for some of them, eviction will be a crisis that results in them ending up on the streets of this rich country.
Thank you, Bill and Denise and Tim. Lots to think about. And I now have some questions that have been come from some of our members. And first, I'll start with one and let each of you have a go at it. In your perspective, from your perspective, have the situations you've described gotten worse over the last 5 years, or is there some improvement in some areas? And I'll just throw this out, maybe Tim, to you first, and then Denise and Bill can chime in.
Yeah, good question. I think the bottom line answer is, and just from my own experience and my own involvement with individuals living on the streets, that it's gotten worse. I think that there's been it's been a more difficult time finding permanent places for people to live, and I think that that's the reality. Basically, I think the reliance on the emergency shelters has become more and more. And as Denise talked about, the emergency shelters serve a purpose, and they're there for a reason, but they're not there to provide permanent housing to people. So I think that that's really the main issue that I've seen. It's become very, very difficult for my patients to be able to access housing that they can call their own, that they can expect to stay in for long periods of time, as rents have gone up and social assistance has not gone up with that. And there has been some improvements in the city. There's been some really excellent programs that have started in the last 5 years, for sure. That the discharge beds program at the Good Shepherd, I think, is a shining example of a really excellent program that does amazing work, that leads with compassion and has the kind of the ethic of making sure that people succeed rather than looking for reasons for people to fail. And so there's definitely been little kind of bright lights that have popped up, but I think overall, I would be lying to you if I said that things have overall gotten better in those 5 years.
I would agree with Tim. And also, many people talk about, and this is further than 5 years, but many people still think the homeless are the single guy who, with a bottle of whiskey in a paper bag. In my dad's generation, they were, called the hobos, and they still haven't sort of stepped out of that reality. And the fact is that they're vulnerable, and we're talking about mental illness and addiction, but also a perfect example is Indigenous population, which I believe makes up 4 to 5% of the Canadian population, but within the homelessness group, it could be up to 20 to 25%. So you see groups like that are becoming more vulnerable. You see way more women, you're seeing more families, and we're seeing more seniors. But across the board, I just noticed that there's so much mental illness. And if people, if they don't fall into homelessness because of mental illness, within a matter of weeks, their health starts to decline so much that the apparently rates of anxiety and depression among the homeless are just through the roof. And you can understand why. It's just a absolutely horrific way to live. So the numbers are higher, and the profiles of the people who are homeless has changed.
Bill?
I think on the whole, I'm going to focus mostly on numbers, but I think on the whole, the numbers are negative. But there are some very positive signs. I think the awareness of the affordable housing issue for the past number of years has been high in Hamilton, which is a good thing. City housing providers are building. Indwell regularly builds new buildings. Sacagawea built the first new housing for Indigenous people in 2 decades in Hamilton. The YW will soon open a 50-bed building on Ottawa Street. And Good Shepherd opened a 35-unit project in an old warehouse a year ago. Those are all impressive. On the other hand, if you add them up, it's a relatively small number in comparison to the demand. I think the same is true of the city's quite commendable $50 million commitment to that they took from the local hydro merger, $5 million a year, which is mostly refurbishing units that can now be brought back on, and that's a good thing. City housing is doing what it can to refurbish old units that have been out of use because they're not in good enough shape to be used. Too often, unfortunately, I think those projects don't produce an increase in the number of subsidized units. I'm quite excited about the collaboration in which all of the city housing providers have come together with a proposal to build 3,000 units in 3 years, if they can get the federal government to commit $900 million to the project. It would make a very good start on the situation. The average number of people staying in city shelters was several hundred people lower between 2015 and 2018 than it had been the previous 4 years. On the other hand, most of the statistics are not improving. The number of people on the city's wait list for a subsidized housing unit was lower in 2019 than 2018, but it was still 6,200 households. 7 years ago, the city set a target of reducing the wait list by half by 2023, but instead the wait list has grown by more than 13%. The wait list is double what it was in 2000. The city has a goal of approving 300 new affordable housing units a year, just to keep up with population growth. Since that goal was set in 2013, it has never met the target. The percentage of renters who pay unaffordable rents has been roughly the same for the past 3 census periods, at about 45% of the tenant population. But the tenant percentage was just 30% in 1991. Rents in Hamilton, as I talked about earlier, are still rising much faster than inflation, and housing prices are rising even faster than rents. And all of that was before COVID.
I'm going to jump in with the next question. And I'm going to direct this one specifically to you, Tim. And it's sort of a batch of questions, and you can take them in whatever order. So we all were paying attention to the encampments over the summer. And the question that people have asked is, are there still encampments or have they all been cleared? How many people from the encampments actually got to be housed, and what happened to the others, and where do you see this going over the winter? So you can just wander through those questions.
Yeah, I'll answer what I'm able. So certainly folks will have seen the larger encampments that sort of grew through the summer in Hamilton. The biggest being on Ferguson Avenue outside the Wesley Day Center, and then another large one by the First Ontario Place. And certainly there was lots of press and lots of attention around those encampments. I think first thing to sort of establish is that there've always been people sleeping in tents, especially in the warmer months in Hamilton. So this wasn't an unusual thing. The unusual thing was the congregation of people into a large area, and that happened primarily because of an injunction that prevented the city from moving people along. So people were able to gather in larger groups. That was lifted, and so an agreement was reached with the city that has a whole bunch of different rules around it. But one of the things that came of that was those large encampments were dismantled, and so people from those two encampments, the city did make an effort to find indoor spaces for people in those areas, whether that was within shelters and emergency shelters or in hotel spaces, which opened up through the COVID pandemic that the city was able to open up. I can say from experience with my patients that not everybody was able to get inside. So certainly from those encampments, people did disperse throughout the city, and you'll see still, if you're driving around town, you'll see little smaller groups of tents in city parks, particularly. The rules at this point with the city is that they can gather in groups of no more than 5 tents. So they're not able to have large encampments, but you may see some smaller ones around town. So certainly there are still people outside. There's people outside in the last couple of nights when it's been, the temperatures dip below 0. That is certainly a concern for us in terms of the outreach work that we're doing. Again, recognizing that this isn't a unique thing this year. We've had people sleeping outside before, so this isn't something new. Although, as Denise was mentioning, I think more people did choose to sleep outside this summer because of fears of COVID in particular. So I share the concern expressed in the question in terms of what's going to happen as the weather gets colder. I think that's a very, very valid concern. I think that this, again, puts a face to the crisis of the fact that we just don't have space for people inside. We don't have enough acceptable places for people to stay, and there's a number of reasons why some of the people that are still outside are outside. So there's too big a variety to characterize it in one way and say, you know, everybody's outside because of this. But suffice to say that there's valid reasons why people are choosing to be outside, despite the fact that it's dangerous to be outside at this point in time. So that in terms of the things that we worry about, obviously cold exposure is a huge problem. We also worry about people keeping themselves warm in unsafe ways. So people are, you know, whether it's with fires or electrical gear that's rigged up inside of tents. All of those things are definitely concerning and things that we're addressing as we're doing the outreach work on a weekly basis.
Thanks very much, Tim. Bill, I'm going to go to you now. The Church's Affordable Housing team attempted in the beginning to keep its focus on housing affordability and not so much focused on homelessness. Can you explain a bit about the rationale for this?
So a part of it was just an attempt to keep the breadth of our work manageable. But we did have another reason. For a lot of people, when you talk about affordable housing, the image that comes to mind is, as Denise was saying, you know, the image of somebody sleeping on a park bench or in a tent on a city street or something like that. And that's a serious issue, but it's only a very small proportion of the number of people who struggle with income that isn't sufficient to meet their housing costs. It would be a tremendous achievement to eradicate homelessness, but achieving that would still leave millions of Canadians paying too much for their housing, with all the implications that has. So we didn't want the politicians or the public or members of our congregation thinking that if we just got rid of homelessness, or even if we just got those people off the streets, that the housing problem would be solved. It wouldn't be. And although lack of affordable housing is only one cause of homelessness, it's also true that there's no solution to homelessness without a significant increase in the amount of affordable housing. So there's a significant overlap in the issues.
Thanks, Bill. Denise, I'm curious about what led you, first of all, to explore the whole issue, and then how did you find Margaret? And then I think you've answered the second part of the question that people asked about how things are different from 2 decades ago to now, but I'm curious about how you found her.
Yeah. So I had been writing about homelessness from the comfort of my newsroom desk at the SPAC for quite a while. And it was all about the studies and reports and research. So I've been writing about the numbers. And I said to my editor, I have to put a face on this story. What would you think of me spending the night at the Wesley drop-in emergency shelter? Because it was known as it was sort of the magnet for really chronically homeless. It allowed people to come and go. There was no curfew. You could smoke. You could come in, you know, smelling of alcohol. All the rules that are at the other shelters. So it really got people like Margaret who were ill, and that's who I wanted to talk to. So I'd interviewed 4 or 5 people, and she came in a little bit late because I got there about 11 p.m. She showed up about midnight. And as Bill said about, you know, how could this happen in Canada? That's what happened in my mind. My brain exploded when I looked at her. I just thought, this cannot be what's happened to this woman. Like, how did she get here? And so I asked a staffer, who is she? Tell me anything you know. And she said, well, she's been coming here for about 10 years. We really know nothing about her. She's never opened up. We think she's has schizophrenia because she can be very erratic and violent. She has a tendency to actually smash people over the head with their hard plastic melamine coffee cups. And so she said, you shouldn't approach her because she can be violent. In fact, some people have ended up in the hospital from talking to her, going too near her cigarettes. And I you know, as Bill said, my head was just floating with these, how did this woman get this way? And so anyways, I walked over to her and I just approached her very quietly from sort of a side and just sort of said, you know, I'd like to speak with you. And she said, I don't care, whatever, you know, and just sat there. She never once looked at me in the face. She just sat there smoking her cigarettes. And I actually, I had a photo that Barry Gray took of her fingers of the smoke, and they were just absolutely caked with nicotine, as if she'd like dipped them in yellow paint or something. But anyways, she opened up and told me her life story over the next 45 minutes. My pen couldn't keep up with her. And I think that what happened was that people probably in the course of her day asked her a lot about where she needed, what she needed. Was she cold? Did she want somewhere to sleep? And I just asked who she was. And I think she really liked it, because at the end of the night, I went off then and interviewed a few other people. She saw me walking out and stood up, both arms over her head, and said, "Hey, where are you going?" And anyways, I saw her a few more times after that. And it was really the story that followed me. I kept like, suddenly her family got in touch with me. I found this boyfriend who she'd met. I ended up, her family are in like Beijing and Massachusetts and everything. And they sent me just tons of all her family photos, because she was a mystery to them. They were relying on me, a stranger, to tell them about their niece and their daughter and their sister, because nobody knew what had happened. She'd gone into the hospital at 17 and basically disappeared from the family. So it was a long process of pulling together her life story. And then the sad part is when I realized this wasn't just Margaret's story. This was the story of tens of thousands of people who were victims of this deinstitutionalization that really just kicked people to the curb. And it's really, no one's been held accountable. There's no reports on what happened to people when they left. And it really is a really dark chapter, I think, in the Canadian psychiatric care.
Thanks so much. And I think you've piqued our interest in the book for sure.
Good.
I'm going to go now from the very personal to the bigger picture. The Code Red research study in Hamilton demonstrated that indicators of health were strongly linked to economic inequity, and these factors had worsened rather than improved over 10 years, which was pretty disappointing. In what ways are homelessness and lack of affordable housing related to these indicators? And I'll just throw that out to whoever wants to go first.
Bill?
Well, I think Tim kind of talked about that early on when he talked about the challenge of and the dramatic change in his patients when they were housed, and the dramatic change in a negative way when they weren't housed. I mean, your housing is just as Tim said, it's like the foundational determinant of your health. You know, if you're in a moldy house, if you're in a drafty house, if you're in an overcrowded house, it's going to be hard to stay healthy. If you're paying too much money for your rent, it's going to be hard to afford all the other necessities of life. There's a pretty strong correlation, for instance, between housing, lack of affordable housing, and lack of good nourishment. And not surprising, the food banks, the annual report noted that their clients tend to pay 70% of their income on their housing. So like there's nothing left to buy quality food. There's that obvious link, but the other thing that's interesting in terms of Code Red was Code Red identified the impacts of health by neighborhoods. And again, a lot of the neighborhoods that have the most poverty also have had the cheapest housing, but that's changing really fast. I mean, the fastest increases in rent, the fastest increases in housing prices are happening in the center of the city and the east end of the city. That's partly because it's on a very low base, but it's also because these are a great bargain to somebody who's got enough money, maybe not to live in Toronto, but to live in Hamilton. So, yeah.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I mean, I think again, this is sort of what we deal with day to day in the work that we're doing with HamSmart, and I think that the one thing that I a lot about is that the healthcare system in Hamilton, I think, is world class. You know, the hospitals in our city are spectacular. We've got great primaries. I've seen people come into the hospital and get, you know, care that you couldn't get anywhere else in the world, and very dedicated professionals providing that care. But some of my patients have come in, and there's some examples where people have come in extremely sick because of a variety of factors, some of which is homelessness. The healthcare system has responded to that as soon as they've come through the door, have done everything that they need to do, intensive care stays, complex operations, rehabilitation. One patient, we added up the estimated cost and the healthcare system for that one hospital stay was near $1 million, but then she was discharged to a shelter. And that patient unfortunately passed away a short time later after losing that shelter bed and being on the streets for a while. And so I think it's a bit of one thing in terms of the code red thing I think a lot about is I think the healthcare system, including myself in that, has failed to grasp the fact that housing is healthcare, and that we wait for people to get sick and come to us and deal with it at that point, rather than being a bit more proactive, being involved in advocating more in the community, talking about the fact that, you know, I mean, we all end up getting paid for all of that services that we do when people come through the door, but we don't really take that next step to say, okay, are we actually making a difference? Are we actually making people healthier when we just discharge them back to the situations that they came from in the first place?
What I would like to add just to what Tim said is that as you talk about the woman who was ill, is the need for supportive services that are tailored to each individual. Because when you see and this came up in COVID when people were being moved into motel rooms and all the centers that were open, and they were provided with a bed and they stayed there for 1 or 2 nights and then they went back on the streets. And a lot of people I've talked to about Margaret sort of look at me and say, well, you know, some people choose to live on the streets. And I said, that's not right. It might be like 1%. But it's that mentality. And they hear stories like that about the fellow who was put up in a nice motel and 2 nights later he's on the street. But without the proper tailor-made, individualized support services, and there's programs in Medicine Hat, Alberta, that they've completely eliminated homelessness, and they've done that by individual housing needs and looking at people with a need, budgeting or help with unemployment or mental illness. All sorts of things, and they've completely eliminated it. So we know how to do it. It's called Housing First, and a huge component of it is having those supports there. And that might sound costly to people, but consider, like I said, the human and economic cost of doing nothing.
Thanks to all of you. I think you've actually covered this question, but I'm just going to allude to it because this summer, 2 of our congregants, Al Sharp and Mary Scott, did some research and decided they wanted to investigate the issue of what turned out to be increasing economic inequality in this country, and produced a 3-part series, which I'm sure you all know about. And I was going to ask about that, but I think you've actually covered how increasing economic inequality is sort of under the problem. But I wonder if there's anything that you want to throw out about potential solutions to that inequality, and then we'll move on to the next question.
One of the things I would note about inequality is that one of the ways, the picture of income growth in the past 40 years is that most of it has taken place at the very top of the income ladder. There's a couple of reasons that contribute to that. One is that increasing amounts of our income comes from investment, and those who have investment, those with wealth get more wealth. But the other was that we've had a lot of tax cutting over the past 40 years. And disproportionately, those tax cuts have benefited the really wealthy, those with the highest incomes. But something else that's occurred increasingly over that 40-year period or 50-year period is the growth of a tremendous number of countries that are essentially tax havens, where the tax rate is either very low or even zero. And you have to be pretty well off to take advantage of a tax haven. But it's been estimated that in Canada, the individuals using tax havens have cost the federal government $3 billion every year, and corporations using tax havens have cost the federal government $22 billion. So one of the things you might be able to do with $3 billion extra a year, for instance, is more than double the amount we spend on housing at the federal level.
Then let me shift back to the health situation. Here's a very specific question. How has COVID impacted the issue of unaffordability and homelessness?
I can comment on how COVID has impacted the emergency shelter piece in particular. I think that's been a fairly uniform effect across the country. We've seen that we've been really lucky here in Hamilton, to be honest with you, that so far we haven't had any major outbreaks in the homeless population from COVID, and that's a combination of some good fortune as well as some really excellent work and planning that has happened at the city level as well as the shelter provider level to mitigate the risk. But in other centers across Canada, there's been large outbreaks. In Toronto, there's been over 600 cases in the homeless population. So the risk of COVID in that congregant setting is real. And because of that risk, as Denise alluded to, people, especially initially, chose to be out of the shelters because they were worried about contracting the virus. And again, it was a very legitimate fear and remains a legitimate fear. Because of that, again, we saw an increase in the number of encampments, both here in Hamilton and across the country. That's an ongoing issue. So I think those would be the negative pressures. I think on the positive side, I think it did, especially initially, it really sort of there was a lot of energy around, okay, is this an opportunity to actually take this on and do something about it? Because we see that this is a crisis and it's more visible now. We have these large encampments that you kind of can't look away from. So I think, again, initially there was a lot of momentum and a lot of discussion around what do we do about it. I get the sense that with a lot of things with COVID, there's some fatigue to that, and I haven't seen the same amount of energy as kind of the second wave has popped up again. But I definitely do think that it was a more visible issue because of COVID than it has been in the past, where it was more kind of hidden away.
I guess I would add to that to reiterate what Tim said too, is because I know, just sitting back watching my TV screen and seeing Trudeau, with his 11 o'clock meetings, press conferences talking about funding for this and funding for that. And, people that have done research on homelessness in any way were just thrilled because this money was finally being made available. They talked less and less about homelessness. There was a sort of spotlight on it for a certain period, and unfortunately that faded a bit. But the frustration for me, just as a viewer, and people that are in the industry are probably more frustrated, is that if only that money, they could sit down and think about it and put it in permanent housing situations and not temporary, with all the motels and First Ontario Centre being opened up. And I know there's that immediate need, but grab the opportunity to do this when funding's being made available, and get some permanent housing, because that's what's needed. Like when you do temporary programs like that, you may as well on way be burning the money, because it's gone the next day. So when they're handing out this many dollars, I'm not sure if it's too late to turn that around and start. But I know of Trudeau that the money has been earmarked more for temporary accommodation, and that's unfortunate.
I would just add that it's given the kind of energy and focus on the issue of, clearly it's important to have a house if you're going to stay home, right, during a pandemic.
Yeah.
And yet the Ontario government brought down a budget that a week ago or so, and there was no new money for, or virtually no new money for housing in that budget. The federal government had their throne speech, and there was $1 billion new for housing in the Rapid Housing Initiative, but it's a 1-year initiative that'll build 3,000 units. And while I welcome particularly the content of it and the way it's being used for that rapid housing, for instance, encouraging prefab buildings that could be a very fast way of building housing, it's I would have hoped that both levels of government would have seen the need, as Denise was saying, for long-term investments in building housing. The 3,000 units we'll get from the Rapid Housing Initiative, we might get 35 in Hamilton, will help, and they'll be permanent, but it's just a tiny amount compared to the need.
Thanks, Bill. I want to look at one more broad question, and then I'm going to take you to suggestions. I don't want to leave people tonight without feeling like there's something positive they can do or an action they can take. But we hear much about the intersectionality of economic inequality, racism, ageism, homophobia. We've talked a lot already tonight about mental disability, but physical disability, addiction. In your findings and experience, talk to us a wee bit about this intersectionality and what you understand about it from your perspective.
I would just briefly say that this is the issue I talked about earlier with Aboriginal people, that there's definitely that intersectionality of, I found a report from 2003, which is many years ago. City of Hamilton, I think it was called the Homeless Continuum Plan. Anyways, it showed 3 stages of homelessness, and how the first stage is when someone is homeless and arrives at a shelter. My understanding is that a large number of people don't progress past that point. There's a certain number that do, and they're usually because of mental illness or addiction. And they go to the second stage. And at the third stage was called the black hole of homelessness. And it's at 14 years or more on the street. I mean, Margaret was well into the black hole. And they said that they're literally in the throes of death at that point. They're just so ill. So, you know, the whole thing too is also in what they're doing in Medicine Hat is that catch it before it happens or within even weeks of it happening, because it's so much harder to reach. And Tim can speak to this, so much harder to reach when they've been on the streets for so long, because they just are so mistrustful of anything out there. But it definitely, I mean, it's like the pandemic. People have said that it's the most vulnerable people, whether they're in long-term care or people with disabilities, are being hurt harder. And the same with homelessness groups.
Thanks, Denise.
Go to Tim.
Tim, were you going to jump in there?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think it's an excellent point. I think people who are homeless are discriminated against. I think it's easy to see. Again, in my experience, mostly is within the healthcare system. People who come into the emergency room, into hospitals, into physicians' offices who are homeless are treated differently than people who are housed. And then that gets compounded by all of the other intersectionality that you mentioned. So add on to that racism, add on to that homophobia, and it gets worse and worse. I think the piece that I've been struggling a lot with is the intersection of addiction with homelessness. And I think that particularly the emergencies shelter system, the homeless sector has not fully embraced a harm reduction mentality around that. And so many of my patients who have substance use disorders struggle to stay in shelters because of the fact that there's no safe way for them to use drugs or to minimize the harms of using drugs within that shelter system. So that I think that's, again, if you think about the intersecting crises that we have in public health right now with the overdose crisis and the COVID crisis, those two things really come down extremely hard on people who don't have a home and a safe place to be.
Bill, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, just to amplify what's already been said. I mean, it's quite clear that people who are Black, people of color, Indigenous people, kind of they kind of pay on both sides of the equation of affordable housing. They tend, on average, to have lower incomes, and they frequently, on the other side, face discrimination when it comes to housing. So even if they could afford the housing that that they've found, they often don't get it. They often get the experience of suddenly discovering that the room that, or the apartment that was available when you talk to the landlord on the phone is already rented when you get there in person, and you're Black or whatever. But there's a couple of other groups that have a particular disadvantage in housing. We have 60,000 people in Hamilton, roughly, who live on their own. Their incomes are obviously less than people who live in a couple or a family, and they face very severe challenges of finding affordable housing. And people who are disabled. There was a statistic that was in the spec a couple of years ago that said that of the 7,000 housing units that city housing has, 63 of them, less than 1%, were accessible by any definition. I mean, that's just astounding. I mean, those would be mostly older units, to be fair, but that's a very low level of accessibility. And that in a city which, is supposed to be a great place to age. I mean, one of the challenges of aging is increasing likelihood of disability. And there were two, and just compounding that, there were two seniors groups that face particular challenges with housing, and that's seniors who rent, who have a very high percentage of paying unaffordable rent, and even worse, single seniors who rent. 2/3 of them pay unaffordable rents.
So I'm now just going to ask you, and I'd given you a heads up that this question was coming, but I want to leave people with some things they can do. What can you tell us, actions that we could take or steps that we could take? How could we make a difference so that you leave us with something that we feel like we can get our teeth into?
Well, I'll start by saying that I can think of three things. It's been really hard to donate your time now, because I know volunteer groups that like Parkside Church in East Hamilton that came out 2 or 3 times a week at 8 p.m. till like midnight in parking lots in Hamilton. And now they've gone from like 25, 30 volunteers to 6. So it's harder to volunteer your time, but I would say if you can do it, those agencies need dollar donations and still like donations of your food items and clothing. So, if you can do that sort of thing. The second thing is, I know that Bill will totally agree with this, is, boy, write to your politician, call them, email them, fax them, like whatever you have to do, because there's those things. Donating your time and money helps day to day, but the whole reason we still have homelessness is the lack of political will. It's not that the money isn't there. If they actually looked at the statistics of how much it's costing to keep people on the street compared to housing, it's a no-brainer. It's just lack of political will. And if enough people write to their MPPs, city councilors, write to Trudeau, I mean, just, and protest, and, I honestly think that's a huge thing. And just on a day-to-day basis, I want to mention this because a lot of people ask, is helping people when you see them on the street. What do you do? And I'll mention Reverend Bill McKinnon because he's worked with the homeless for 40 years. And I just think it's important to give. I think it's important. And people say, what if they're going to spend it on alcohol? It's like, you know what? Panhandling is a tough job. it's cold, it's undignified, it's people don't ignore you, you feel invisible. I would encourage people to help out if they see a panhandler on the street, because it's like I said, it's a tough job, and that's something you can do. I try to carry sort of spare change with me and give when I can, and but that's something that's very immediate, and and then just research the issue. Like I said, look up like Medicine Hat, Alberta. They're doing amazing things out there, and why other communities aren't sort of tapping them to come and give a talk or find out more about them, and doing the same in their community is, again, lack of political will.
Thanks, Denise. Who's next?
I'll leave the last word to Bill. So I'll jump in. So yeah, I mean, I don't know if I have three, but a couple of things I would say is, first off, I agree with Denise. I think one thing is really political pressure. So making sure that municipal, provincial, federal politicians know that this is an important issue to you is extremely a very valuable intervention that you can do very easily by writing letters, pick up the phone, send an email. The other piece to that, I think, is responding to and calling out the demonization of homelessness. So you will see politicians, you will see, you're on like neighborhood Facebook groups, you'll see people going on and putting up pictures of encampments or whatever and talking very negatively about people. It happens often. And I think when you see that, calling that out very quickly, whether that be calling your city councilor or posting back onto Facebook or saying to your friends, really, I mean, unless you know those people, you can't really talk about them or judge them or say anything about them. I think that would be the first issue. The people I work with are almost uniformly very lovely, easy to get along with people, but I don't even think that necessarily matters. I think if we start to get into a conversation about who deserves housing, we really go down a slippery slope very quickly, just recognizing the fact that people are living a very, very hard life, and whatever we can do to help them is an important thing to do. So political pressure, calling out any sort of very judgmental and discriminatory language that you hear at any level. If you live in Hamilton, you'll see encampments around. There may be some in your neighborhood. There may be some in parks. Treat that as people's living space, but I think it's very reasonable to go and say, hey, anybody there? Is there anything I can do? Do you need any help? Do you need a blanket? Do you need some coffee? Do you need some muffins? And just sort of treating those people like your neighbors. They are part of our community. They have the same rights as everybody else, and recognizing that they do have the same human rights as everybody else when they're in those spaces, I think, is an important piece as well. Lots of organizations in the city doing great work, so finding some of them and supporting them as well. Bill mentioned Indwell. I didn't mention them off the top as well. Really impressive work that they're doing. Good Shepherd, Salvation Army, Mission Services, Keeping Six, which is an outreach group for people who use drugs as well. All of those groups could use your help as well. So I think any of those would be great.
Thanks, Tim.
So I'm probably going to end up mostly repeating. I had listed learn, donate, and advocate. So learn, there are lots of organizations both in Hamilton and across the country that provide, you can sign up and get their emails, and they provide great either studies or blogs or just information. Tim's group and the Keeping Six, I think, are having some kind of event on the 26th of November that'll probably be doing some update on some of the things that Tim talked about. There's just so much to learn. Donate, as people have already said, there are lots of good organizations, whether it's time or money, if you can afford money. Denise talked about giving to panhandlers, and the other thing that I've heard, and I've tried it on occasion, and it's actually kind of moving to do so, is it's pretty lonely on the street. And most people ignore you. At best, they ignore you, and they probably treat you rather badly. And just to have somebody stop, and even if you're going to say, I don't have any money in my pocket, but just to say, how you doing, or just to stop and acknowledge that you've been asked for a donation, I think is treats, as Tim was saying, treats them like a human being. And then, yes, advocate. Somebody suggested the other day that to me, as we were talking about writing letters to politicians, that, it can be hard writing letters when you're doing it all by yourself. So find a couple of buddies to work with and swap ideas or different ways of phrasing things or stuff. But when you feel comfortable, I think the most powerful thing you can do is actually try to visit your politicians, meet with them as people, because they're people with their own priorities and challenges as they try to represent you. But also they need to hear, and the most powerful way they hear is directly, that you care about this issue, that it's not something they can sweep under the rug, but there are people out there who vote and for whom this issue, however you phrase the issue and however specific you can get, it matters.
Yeah.
Thanks, Bill. Thanks to all three of you, Denise, Tim, and Bill, for sharing tonight from both your heads and your hearts. You've given us much to reflect on, and thank you for leaving us with actions we can take. Each of us can do some of those things, one of them at least, however small. And in this complicated and stressful time, I think we all need to feel a sense of purpose. And I think you've given us that tonight, and I'm really appreciative. Thank you. But just before we close, a few details so you can follow up. This event will be posted on the church YouTube site and will be available to all. The link will be on the screen at the end of the program, along with the links to the three-part series that Alan did on economic inequality, the link to Tim's October the 4th homily, information about how to pre-order Denise's book. And if you want more information about social justice work in our church, you can just email socialjustice@uuhamilton.ca, or for housing, housing@uuhamilton.ca. And in a moment, these links will go up on the screen. If you're like me, you'll want to go back and listen again to tonight's program to catch the details and some of the ideas that tonight's panelists have shared. Once again, we're grateful to all three of you for sharing your time and your knowledge with us tonight. Good night, all.